The morning of June 21st, 2024, began like any other Friday in Fordyce, Arkansas. A quiet town of just over 3,000 people, a place where strangers rarely stay, strangers where routines feel permanent, and where the Mad Butcher grocery store was more than a place to shop, it was the heart of the community. People didn't just buy food there. They talked, they caught up, they felt safe. No one inside that parking lot had any idea that within minutes, this ordinary morning would become the deadliest active violent incident in the United States that entire year. Travis Eugene Posey was not a name that raised alarms in Fordyce. At 44 years old, he had spent his life in nearby New Edinburgh. He ran a landscaping business. He operated a small trucking service. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, he appeared unremarkable, a working man living an unremarkable life. There were no public warnings, no obvious signs, nothing that suggested what he was about to do. But on that June afternoon, Posey armed himself heavily. A 12-gauge shotgun, a handgun, and a bandolier loaded with dozens of extra shotgun shells. In broad daylight, he drove directly to the Mad Butcher. Without warning, he opened fire in the parking lot. Shoppers dropped where they stood. Others dove behind vehicles, unable to process what they were hearing. The sound of gunfire shattered the illusion of safety that had defined Fordyce for generations. Screams filled the air as people ran, hid, or froze in shock. Posey didn't stop. He walked toward the entrance and stepped inside the store. Customers and employees were hit where they stood in aisles they had walked through hundreds of times before. Among them was Roy Sturgis, a 50-year-old man who had just bought steak for his weekly Sunday dinner tradition. He never made it back to his car. Callie Williams was only 23 years old. A nurse by profession, she reacted on instinct when she saw people wounded and collapsing around her. She ran toward them, not away, to try to help. In doing so, she was struck down while attempting to save others. Inside the store, Shirley K. Taylor, 62, became another victim. Ellen Shrum, 81 years old, was gravely wounded and would pass away the following day. 11 additional people were hit by gunfire, their lives forever altered in minutes they would never forget. Law enforcement arrived quickly. An exchange followed. Posey was wounded but taken into custody alive. He was treated for non-life-threatening injuries and immediately placed under arrest. The scene he left behind was one of devastation, blood-stained floors, shattered families, and a town struggling to understand how its sense of safety had been destroyed so suddenly. The question echoed everywhere. Investigators searched for motive. Friends searched their memories. Families searched for meaning. But Posey offered nothing. No explanation, no rationale, no remorse. 4 days later, on June 25th, Posey made his first court appearance. Standing before Judge Spencer Singleton, he entered a plea of not guilty to 4 capital charges and 10 counts related to attempted harm. A trial date was set for February 3rd, 2025. Fordyce waited. The Mad Butcher closed temporarily, leaving the town without its only grocery store. Emergency food distribution centers were established. Assistance poured in from across Arkansas. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders ordered flags lowered to half-staff. On June 23rd, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil. Candles lined the parking lot where lives had been taken. Names were spoken aloud. Tears flowed freely. Then in July 2025, everything changed. Posey's defense team negotiated a plea agreement. During a pretrial hearing on July 21st, Posey stood and admitted guilt on all counts. The trial families had waited over a year for what would never happen. Sentencing took place on August 4th. 15 people delivered victim impact statements. One survivor described staring down the barrel of Posey's weapon. A daughter spoke about a father who would never walk her down the aisle. A mother described the unbearable reality of raising her granddaughter without her daughter ever coming home. Posey remained largely expressionless. Some witnesses reported seeing a faint smirk. Judge Singleton sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 220 years. Posey was transferred to the Arkansas Department of Corrections to begin serving his sentence. The Mad Butcher eventually reopened 11 days later. But Fordyce was no longer the same. Every aisle carried memory. Every visit carried weight. And the man responsible left behind no explanation, only silence and a community forever changed. Some criminals commit their acts in one place at one moment, leaving investigators to piece together a single scene. Others move. They drift across counties, across state lines, leaving fragments of devastation behind until someone finally realizes the violence isn't isolated, it's connected. Stacey Lee Drake was the latter. At 50 years old, Drake was already familiar to the criminal justice system. In 2010, he had been sentenced in federal court in Alabama to 22 years for a violent incident. But in 2017, his sentence was reduced. Years later, shortly before 2024, he was released. That decision would haunt families across 3 states. The violence appears to have begun in Alabama. On May 14, 2024, 62-year-old Russell Andrews was found inside an Alcoholics Anonymous building in Tuscaloosa. Andrews was a longtime volunteer, someone who dedicated his time to helping people fight addiction. When he was discovered, something was immediately wrong. His vehicle was missing. Investigators soon learned that Drake had been attending AA meetings at the same building for at least a week before Andrews was found. Security footage later captured Andrews' vehicle being driven hundreds of miles away near the Arkansas-Oklahoma border. Drake was already moving. He traveled west into Oklahoma, settling temporarily in the El Reno area. There, on an early June date, he entered the home of 56-year-old Philip Emerson. At first, authorities believed Emerson's passing was due to natural causes, but inconsistencies quickly emerged. The injuries told a different story. Emerson had suffered trauma consistent with violence, and once again, Drake disappeared. On June 18, 2024, the pattern escalated. That afternoon, Drake walked into LaFleur County Propane in Gans, Oklahoma, just miles from the Arkansas state line. Security cameras captured him entering between 2:49 and 3:05 p.m. Inside were 2 employees, Tara Barnett Underwood, and Taylor Sharp. When Drake exited the building, both employees were gone. He drove away in one of their vehicles, a stolen SUV that would soon become his undoing. Tara Underwood left behind 3 children. She was engaged to a man with 3 children of his own. 6 children in total would now grow up without the parents who were supposed to raise them together. Her sister later asked the public to remember Tara not for how she died, but for the warmth and joy she brought into every room she entered. By that point, law enforcement across multiple states realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a single crime. A multi-state manhunt began. Late Tuesday night, the stolen vehicle was spotted at a motel 6 inches Morrilton, Arkansas. Arkansas State Police coordinated with Oklahoma investigators. Emergency alerts were sent to cell phones across the region, warning residents to stay alert and report any sightings. Authorities believed Drake had purchased camping supplies and was hiding in wooded areas nearby. For 2 days, fear spread. Then, on the morning of June 20th, relief finally arrived. Law enforcement located Drake in a wooded area outside Morrilton. He was found lying in a hammock, apparently resting. Nearby were scattered personal items, $1, 500 inches cash, Taylor Sharp's driver's license, and a disassembled firearm. Drake was taken into custody without resistance. The arrest brought relief to communities across Alabama, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. But the relief was short-lived for families who knew the legal process was only beginning. The following day, Drake appeared before a judge for an extradition hearing. When reporters asked if he had harmed the victims, he refused to answer. He waived his right to contest extradition and was transferred immediately to Oklahoma. Over the following months, prosecutors worked to assemble the full scope of his crimes. In August 2024, a 3rd charge was officially added for the death of Philip Emerson. Prosecutors successfully argued that Emerson's case should be combined with the Oklahoma double homicide, citing a clear pattern of movement, opportunity, and escalating violence. Drake's preliminary hearing stretched over 2 days in May 2025. The evidence was substantial. On May 6th, the judge ruled there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Days later, District Attorney Jack Thorpe formally announced prosecutors would seek the most severe sentence available under Oklahoma law. Drake entered a plea of not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree charges. His trial was scheduled for September 2025. For the families left behind, the court proceedings offered little comfort. Tara Barnett's sister and niece attended hearings to ensure their loved ones were not reduced to footnotes in a legal battle. "There are 6 kids now without their parents," she stated plainly. "We deserve justice." As of now, Drake remains incarcerated without bail. Alabama officials have stated that if Oklahoma's case does not result in permanent incarceration, additional charges await him there as well. Across 3 states, communities continue to process the same haunting question. How did someone with a known violent history move freely long enough to leave so much devastation behind? And how many opportunities were missed to stop him before the pattern became clear? Drake's case stands as a chilling reminder that when systems fail to recognize warning signs, violence doesn't stay contained. It travels, it multiplies, and it leaves families searching for answers that may never come. Terror doesn't always announce itself with gunfire or sirens. Sometimes it arrives quietly through a phone call meant to save a life. On the night of April 16, 2023, emergency dispatchers in Fayetteville, Arkansas, received a call that would stay with them long after their shifts ended. At first, it sounded like a routine domestic disturbance, an argument, a household in conflict, something officers handle every day. But this call would end differently. On the line was Dr. Amy Phelps Joyner, 39 years old. Amy was a respected pathologist and partner at Northwest Arkansas Pathology Associates. She had built a career defined by precision and discipline, earning her medical degree and completing her residency at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences. To her colleagues, she was dependable. To her friends, she was warm and deeply thoughtful. She was also trying to leave a marriage that had become dangerous. Her husband, Marcus Joyner, was intoxicated that night. His behavior was erratic, aggressive. Amy recognized the warning signs, and she did exactly what victims are told to do. She called 911. At first, her voice was steady. She answered the dispatcher's questions clearly, explaining that her husband was under the influence and acting aggressively. She tried to stay calm, tried to stay in control, even as fear crept into her tone. Then everything changed. Mid-call, Amy began screaming. The composure disappeared, replaced by raw panic. The dispatcher tried desperately to calm her, to get information to keep her talking. But suddenly, silence. Amy stopped responding. The dispatcher continued calling out her name, urging her to answer. And then over the open line, another voice came through. A male voice, cold, controlled. You wanted it like this. Those words, brief and deliberate, would later become critical evidence. They revealed intent, awareness, and a chilling lack of remorse. At nearly the same time, another 911 call came in. A neighbor reported hearing screams and seeing something disturbing in the roadway near East Thornhill Drive. The caller described a woman on the ground and a man kneeling over her in a way that suggested repeated strikes. When Fayetteville police arrived, they encountered a scene that would haunt even seasoned officers. In the middle of the street lay Amy's body. She was motionless, not breathing. A knife protruded from her neck. Her cell phone lay nearby, still connected to 911. The dispatcher's voice could still be heard calling out, unaware that the person on the other end would never answer again. Blood pooled around her body. Bare, bloody footprints led away from the scene and back toward the house. Officers spotted a man wearing only jeans, his body covered in blood, walking away. He ignored commands to stop and retreated into the residence. Police surrounded the home immediately. Minutes later, Marcus emerged and surrendered. He had injuries of his own, a wound to the left side of his chest that required medical attention but was not life-threatening. At the hospital, doctors documented defensive injuries, cuts inside both hands, and a swollen right hand consistent with gripping a blade. Body camera footage confirmed what investigators already suspected. The first officer had arrived within seconds of Amy's final moments. Marcus was held under guard at Washington Regional Medical Center until April 20th, when he was formally arrested and transferred to the Washington County Jail. He was charged with capital charges, the most serious offense available under Arkansas law. On May 22nd, Marcus entered a plea of not guilty. Bond was set at $750,000. The legal process moved slowly. A trial date was initially scheduled for July 11, 2023, but delays followed. Both prosecution and defense requested continuances. Months passed. For Amy's family and friends, each delay felt like reopening the wound. Then, on February 6, 2024, nearly 10 months after Amy's passing, Marcus appeared in court once again. What everyone expected to be another procedural hearing turned into something else entirely. Marcus changed his plea. Standing before Judge Joanna Taylor, he admitted guilt. "I took Amy's life," he said. "I attacked her until she was gone." There was no justification, no claim of accident, just a flat, devastating acknowledgement. Judge Taylor's response was measured but firm. "You took another life," she said, And you did not have the right to do that. You took the life of someone you had pledged to love, to cherish, to honor, and to protect. The court allowed Amy's family to deliver victim impact statements. Her mother Trudy spoke through tears about a future ripped away without warning, about realizing too late that there had been so little time left. We had no idea. We had so little time, she said, finding strength only through faith. Friends described Amy not as a statistic or a victim, but as a person. Bright, intelligent, welcoming, a woman who made others feel safe until she herself was no longer safe at home. Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the Arkansas Department of Corrections to serve the remainder of his life behind bars. But the story did not end there. On February 2, 2025, almost exactly 1 year after his sentencing, Marcus Joyner passed away while incarcerated at a facility in eastern Arkansas. He was 42 years old. Arkansas State Police confirmed his passing and stated an investigation was underway. The cause was not immediately disclosed. For Amy's loved ones, the news brought complicated emotions. The man who took her life was now gone, but closure did not come with him. Amy's case became part of domestic violence awareness campaigns across Arkansas. Her final 911 call, harrowing and incomplete, served as a reminder of an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is often when someone decides to leave. Amy recognized the danger. She reached out for help, but help didn't arrive in time. Her family has asked that she be remembered by her maiden name Amy Phelps as a way of reclaiming her identity from the violence that tried to define her ending. She was a physician, a daughter, a friend, not just a voice that went silent on a phone line. For years, millions of Americans believed they were watching something wholesome. A large family, strong faith, traditional values. Smiling children lined up on a couch presenting an image of moral certainty in a world many felt was losing it. Reality television sold that image as authenticity. But sometimes what cameras capture is not truth, only performance. At the center of that carefully constructed image stood Josh Duggar. Born March 3, 1988, Joshua James Duggar was the eldest child of Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, a devoutly religious family from Springdale, Arkansas. They practiced independent Baptist Christianity, homeschooling their children and emphasizing strict moral discipline. When television producers began documenting their lives in the mid-2000s, the Duggars became a cultural phenomenon. By 200819, Kids and Counting debuted on TLC, introducing the family to millions of viewers nationwide. Josh, as the oldest son, was presented as responsible, composed, and morally upright, the example his parents wanted the world to see. In September 2008, Josh married Anna Keller. Together they would eventually have 7 children. Josh went on to secure a high-profile position as a lobbyist for the Family Research Council in Washington, D.C., advocating publicly for conservative family values. To outsiders, it looked like success. But behind the scenes, the image was already cracking. In 2015, reports surfaced that when Josh was a teenager, he had engaged in deeply inappropriate behavior involving minors, including 4 of his own sisters. The incidents had occurred years earlier, but were handled privately within the family, and religious community never reported to law enforcement at the time. When the information became public, the backlash was immediate. 19, Kids and Counting was canceled. Sponsors fled. The Duggar family's carefully maintained public image collapsed almost overnight. Josh issued a public statement admitting to wrongdoing and asking for forgiveness. He entered what the family described as counseling. For a moment, it appeared the story might end there with scandal, but not criminal consequences. It did not. Later that same year, another revelation emerged. A data breach exposed that Josh had paid nearly $1,000 for accounts on a website facilitating extramarital affairs beginning in 2013. Once again, Josh admitted fault, stating he had been unfaithful to his wife. The public saw a pattern forming, but law enforcement was already investigating something far more serious. In November 2019, federal authorities began quietly tracking suspicious online activity involving file-sharing programs, distributing material depicting minors. The digital trail led to a used car dealership in Arkansas, owned by Josh Duggar. In April 2021, federal agents arrested Josh. He was charged with receiving and possessing illegal material involving minors, federal offenses, carrying significant prison time. The investigation revealed deliberate efforts to conceal his actions. Josh had created a password-protected partition on a desktop computer at the dealership, a hidden section invisible to normal users. This allowed him to bypass accountability software known as Covenant Eyes, which had been installed to monitor internet activity and alert his wife if concerning content was accessed. Within that hidden digital space, investigators discovered hundreds of files downloaded over a 3-day period in May 2019. When Homeland Security agents executed a search warrant at the dealership, Josh's reaction raised immediate red flags. Before agents explained why they were there, he asked, "Has someone been downloading inappropriate material?" It was a question no one had asked yet. Cell phone records placed Josh at the dealership during the exact times the material was accessed. Text messages and photos he sent during those windows further confirmed his presence. He was the only paid employee at the location. The evidence was overwhelming. Josh's trial began in December 2021 in federal court. Prosecutors presented detailed forensic testimony, carefully dismantling defense claims that an unknown individual might have accessed the computer remotely. On December 9th, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. Josh cried as U.S. Marshals handcuffed him and led him away. Sentencing took place on May 25, 2022, before U.S. District Judge Timothy Brooks. Prosecutors requested the maximum sentence. The defense argued for leniency. Judge Brooks sentenced Josh to 151 months, 12.5 years, in federal prison, followed by 20 years of supervised release. He was ordered to register as a sex offender, pay fines, and was prohibited from unsupervised contact with his own children during supervision. Josh appealed. In August 2023, a 3-judge panel unanimously rejected his appeal. His legal team petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court. On June 24, 2024, the court declined to hear the case, exhausting all remaining legal options. Josh is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in Texas, with a projected release date in October 2032. Even behind bars, the pattern continued. He was disciplined after being found with a contraband cell phone, an act that extended his incarceration further. The Duggar story became a cautionary tale. For years, family image was prioritized over accountability. Faith was emphasized without oversight. Forgiveness was offered without transparency. And the result was harm that extended far beyond one individual. For Josh's 7 children, the consequences will follow them for life. The man once held up as a symbol of moral virtue became an example of how carefully constructed identities collapse when truth is exposed. Cameras may hide cracks for a while, but they cannot conceal reality forever. Some cases bring a sense of finality when the verdict is read. Others never truly end because long after the sentence is carried out, the questions refuse to disappear. The case of Daniel Lewis Lee belongs firmly to the second category. Lee's name became nationally known not only for the brutality of the crime he was convicted of, but for what followed decades later, an execution that reignited debates about justice, proportionality, and whether the system itself had failed. Daniel Lewis Lee was born on January 31, 1973 Yukon, Oklahoma. His childhood was unstable, marked by dysfunction and untreated mental health issues. As a teenager, he accumulated a record of escapes from custody and gravitated toward extremist ideology. By the mid-1990s, Lee had become deeply involved with white supremacist groups operating across the Midwest. In 1995, he lost his left eye in a bar fight after using a racial slur toward a Native American man. He refused to wear an eye patch and adopted the nickname Cyclops among his associates, wearing his violence as identity. That same year, Lee met Chevy Kehoe, a committed white supremacist attempting to establish a whites-only nation known as the Aryan People's Republic. Kehoe recruited Lee into his circle. What followed would end 3 lives. On January 11, 1996, Lee and Kehoe arrived at the rural Arkansas home of William Frederick Mueller, a 52-year-old gun dealer living near Tilley in Pope County. Dressed as federal law enforcement officers, they broke into the house and waited. When William returned home with his wife Nancy and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah Elizabeth Powell, the 2 men ambushed them. They restrained all 3 victims. Using stun guns, they demanded to know where firearms, ammunition, and cash were hidden. Little Sarah was forced to reveal locations while being shocked. After taking roughly $50, 0 inches cash, and tens of thousands of dollars in firearms, Lee and Kehoe decided the family could not be left alive. Plastic bags were placed over the heads of William, Nancy, and Sarah, sealed with duct tape. All three suffocated. The bodies were later transported to Illinois, bayou weighted down with rocks, and dumped into the water. They surfaced months later in Lake Dardanelle. The investigation moved quickly once stolen firearms began appearing. Federal agencies arrested Lee in September 1997. He and Kehoe were tried together in 1998. Both were convicted. But here is where the controversy began. Despite evidence showing Kehoe as the leader and planner, the jury declined to sentence him to death. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. Daniel Lee, the accomplice, was sentenced to death. Even the trial judge expressed reservations, ordering a new sentencing hearing. But in 2001, a federal appeals court ruled that Lee must be sentenced to death regardless. The disparity between the sentences would follow the case for decades. Perhaps most striking of all, the victim's own family opposed Lee's execution. Nancy Mueller's mother, Erlene Peterson, became an outspoken advocate against it. She stated repeatedly that ending Lee's life would not bring healing, it would only add more loss. She wanted no part in an execution carried out in her granddaughter's name. Lee remained on federal death row for over 20 years. Then in July 2019, U.S. Attorney General William Barr ordered the resumption of federal executions after a nearly 2-decade pause. Lee was selected as the first inmate to be executed under the revived system. The timing could not have been more controversial. The execution was scheduled for July 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Mueller family filed legal challenges, arguing that traveling to the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, would put them at serious health risk. They wanted to be present specifically to oppose the execution publicly. A federal judge issued a temporary halt. An appeals court overturned it. Further concerns emerged when it was revealed that a Bureau of Prisons staff member involved in execution preparations had tested positive for COVID-19. On the night of July 13, 2020, Lee was strapped to a gurney for more than 4 hours as last-minute legal motions moved through the courts. When the final legal barrier fell at approximately 4:30 a.m., the execution proceeded almost immediately. Lee's attorneys were not notified in advance. When asked for final words, Lee maintained his innocence. "I didn't do it," he said. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not someone who harms others. You're ending the life of an innocent man." At 8:07 a.m., on July 14, 2020, Daniel Lee was pronounced dead, the first person executed by the federal government in 17 years. Attorney General Barr issued a statement declaring justice had been served. But for the Mueller family, the execution created a different kind of burden. They now carried the weight of knowing someone had been executed against their explicit wishes in the name of a justice they did not seek. Lee's case did not bring closure. Instead, it deepened debate. Why was the follower executed while the leader lived? Why were the victims' families' wishes ignored? Why resume executions during a pandemic? Daniel Lee's story moved from crime to punishment to controversy, leaving behind no clear resolution, only unresolved moral questions that continued to divide public opinion. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the person you trust most. Not an enemy, not a stranger, but someone who knows your routines, your finances, your fears, and your front door. That was the reality behind the death of former Arkansas State Senator Linda Collins. And the person responsible, prosecutors would later argue, was the woman Linda considered her best friend. Rebecca O'Donnell was not an outsider in Linda Collins' life. She was woven into it. Linda Collins had built her political career on outspoken conservatism and relentless advocacy for rural Arkansans. Born and raised in Pocahontas, Arkansas, she grew up in modest circumstances and developed a reputation for being fiercely independent. She served in the Arkansas House of Representatives starting in 2010, then won a seat in the state Senate in 2014 after switching parties. Her political career was combative. She clashed openly with colleagues, challenged her own party's leadership, and earned a reputation as someone unafraid to burn bridges. But her public confidence masked a personal life under strain. Linda's marriage to Circuit Court Judge Philip Smith unraveled publicly in 2017 amid scandal and a contentious divorce involving roughly $2 million in assets. By 2018, she lost her Senate seat in a tight Republican primary, ending the political platform she had occupied for nearly a decade. Through all of it, one person remained constantly by her side: Rebecca O'Donnell. Rebecca worked on Linda's campaigns. She helped manage business ventures. She was so trusted that she served as a witness during Linda's divorce proceedings. Linda's fiancé, Tim Loggins, later described their relationship as sister-like. They even co-owned a hotel together. On May 28, 2019, Rebecca took Linda to lunch. It was the last confirmed sighting of Linda Collins alive. In the days that followed, Linda seemed to vanish. Text messages went unanswered. Social media activity stopped abruptly. Her daughter, Tate Williams, grew increasingly concerned. On June 4th, Linda's father and her son Butch went to her home to check on her. What they found would permanently scar them. Linda's car sat in the driveway. No one answered the door. Butch began searching the property. In the driveway, partially concealed beneath a tarp, he found his mother's body. She had been there for approximately a week, wrapped in an old comforter, decomposing in the Arkansas heat. When law enforcement arrived, the condition of the body made immediate identification difficult. Randall County Sheriff Kevin Bell later described the remains as being in an advanced state of deterioration. An autopsy would confirm multiple stab wounds. Inside the house, investigators found a dark stain on the kitchen floor, initially believed to be spilled coffee. Testing revealed it was blood. A bottle of cleaning solution sat nearby, smeared with what appeared to be blood residue. Someone had tried to erase what happened. But Linda Collins had installed a home security system. Although someone had removed the cameras and attempted to delete the footage, investigators were able to recover cloud-stored recordings. One clip from May 28th showed a woman inside Linda's home holding a blood-covered knife. That woman was Rebecca O'Donnell. Another piece of footage showed someone returning later under cover of darkness, draped in a white sheet, re-entering the home. The implication was chilling. The investigation narrowed quickly. On June 14th, 10 days after Linda's body was discovered, Rebecca was arrested during a traffic stop. She was on her way to Linda's memorial service. Initially, Rebecca claimed innocence. She suggested she had been framed and implied that Linda's ex-husband was responsible. Some people believed her. Even Linda's fiancé publicly defended Rebecca at first, saying he couldn't imagine her capable of such violence. But investigators followed the money. Search warrants revealed that Rebecca had been forging Linda's signature and writing checks to herself. She had been systematically stealing from her closest friend. When Linda discovered the theft and confronted her, prosecutors said Rebecca snapped. The motive wasn't political. It was financial and deeply personal. As the case moved forward, Rebecca's behavior grew even more disturbing. While incarcerated and awaiting trial, she was recorded passing a note to fellow inmates attempting to hire them to harm Philip Smith and make it look self-inflicted. The attempt resulted in 2 additional charges of criminal solicitation. On August 6, 2020, more than a year after Linda's death, Rebecca appeared in court. What was expected to be another procedural hearing turned into a confession. "I went to Linda's house," Rebecca said. "I intentionally ended her life and then hid the body." She pleaded guilty to first-degree charges and abuse of a corpse. She also entered no contest pleas on the solicitation charges. In exchange, prosecutors removed the possibility of the most severe penalty. The judge sentenced Rebecca to 40 years for the primary charge, 3 years for abuse of remains, and 14 years for the solicitation counts, totaling 57 years, with some sentences running concurrently. Her effective sentence would require decades behind bars before parole eligibility. During sentencing, Linda's children spoke. Butch described finding his mother's body as an image that would never leave him. Tate spoke about the betrayal, the shock of realizing that the person they trusted most was the one who took everything. Rebecca is currently incarcerated under an interstate compact, meaning she is serving her sentence outside Arkansas. Her exact location has not been disclosed for security reasons. Linda Collins' story did not end in political conspiracy or ideological violence. It ended with greed, with betrayal, with a trusted friend who chose theft over honesty and violence over accountability. What happens when a man maintains his innocence from the moment of arrest until the moment of execution, only for new evidence to surface after he is already gone? That question sits at the heart of one of the most disturbing cases in Arkansas history. Liddell Lee was executed by the state of Arkansas in 2017 for a 1,993 killing. For years, his conviction stood as settled law. But what came afterward would shake confidence in that finality and raise terrifying doubts about whether the state carried out an irreversible mistake. On the morning of February 9, 1993, 6-year-old Deborah Reese was attacked in her home in Jacksonville, Arkansas. She was a beloved wife and mother. During the assault, she was beaten with a tire iron, a weapon her husband had given her for protection. She later passed from her injuries. The community demanded justice. Within days, police arrested Liddell Lee, a black man from the neighborhood. From the moment he was taken into custody, Lee insisted he was innocent. He maintained that position for the rest of his life. The case against him, however, was thin. There was no physical evidence directly linking Lee to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints. The prosecution relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and witness statements that were later heavily criticized. Several witnesses changed their stories. Others described seeing someone who merely looked like Lee. Lee's first trial ended in a hung jury. The evidence was not strong enough to convince all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors tried him again. The second trial took place in a county that was nearly one-third black, yet the jury consisted of 11 white jurors and 1 black juror. That jury convicted Lee. In 1997, he was sentenced to death. But the problems in Lee's case didn't stop there. The trial judge was later revealed to have been in a romantic relationship with the prosecuting attorney, a conflict of interest that should have resulted in immediate recusal. It did not. Even more alarming, Lee's defense attorney showed up to court intoxicated. His impairment was so severe that Lee eventually won new proceedings because of it. But the damage was already done. Subsequent defense teams failed to raise critical issues. They did not fully challenge the judge-prosecutor relationship. They did not aggressively pursue Lee's claims of innocence. They did not push for modern DNA testing on evidence collected at the scene, evidence that could have identified the real perpetrator. Lee spent more than 2 decades on death row. During that time, technology advanced dramatically. DNA testing that was impossible or unavailable in the early 1990s became routine. Hair samples, fingernail scrapings, and fingerprints could now be analyzed with unprecedented accuracy. But Lee was never granted access to that testing. In April 2017, Arkansas announced it would execute 8 death row inmates in 11 days. The reason was not justice or urgency, it was logistics. The state's supply of lethal injection drugs was set to expire at the end of the month. Liddell Lee was scheduled to be first. Just 2 weeks before his execution date, the Innocence Project and the ACLU intervened. They reviewed the case and immediately identified major red flags. Evidence existed that had never been tested with modern DNA methods. Hairs from the bedroom, scrapings from under Deborah Reese's fingernails, 5 fingerprints from key areas of the crime scene, all potentially identifying. Emergency motions were filed asking the courts to allow DNA testing before the execution. The request was modest: pause the execution long enough to test evidence that could confirm guilt or prove innocence. Arkansas said no. The case raced through the courts. Federal judges issued temporary stays. Appeals courts overturned them. As the clock ticked down, the legal fight became increasingly desperate. On the evening of April 20th, 2017, just hours before Lee's execution warrant was set to expire, the United States Supreme Court briefly delayed the execution to consider the appeals. Then, in a 5-4 decision, the court allowed the execution to proceed. Justice Neil Gorsuch cast the deciding vote, his first major decision as a Supreme Court justice. At 1:56 p.m., 4 minutes before the execution warrant expired, Liddell Lee was executed by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence to the end. Arkansas officials declared that justice had been carried out. 4 years later, in 2021, the DNA testing Lee had begged for finally happened. The results were stunning. DNA found on the wooden club used in the attack and on a bloody shirt wrapped around it did not belong to Liddell Lee. Instead, it matched an unknown male. 5 fingerprints recovered from the crime scene also did not match Lee. The unknown DNA profile was entered into national databases. No match has yet been identified. The case remains technically open. Nina Morrison of the Innocence Project stated that a wealth of new evidence supports Lee's claim of innocence, evidence that should have been considered while he was still alive. Arkansas officials responded by calling the results inconclusive, emphasizing that a jury had convicted Lee based on the evidence available at the time. But that response avoided the central issue. The jury never saw the full picture because the most important evidence was never tested. Lee's case highlights devastating flaws in the administration of capital punishment, race, quality of legal representation, conflicts of interest, and a system willing to prioritize speed over certainty. To date, hundreds of people have been exonerated through post-conviction DNA testing, exactly the kind Lee requested. For Liddell Lee, that chance came too late. The tragedy is not just that he may have been innocent, it is that the state chose finality over truth, convenience over caution, and expiration dates over justice. And now the man, who could have been cleared or definitively proven guilty, is gone forever. Sometimes, the most dangerous moment in a relationship is not during the arguments. It's the moment someone decides to leave. That truth became tragically clear in February 2016 when Stacey Devine made a decision she believed would give her a new beginning. Instead, it ended her life. Stacey was 41 years old, a mother, a woman trying to reclaim control after years in a deteriorating marriage. On February 11, 2016, she called her son and told him something that was both frightening and hopeful. She was leaving her husband. She said she was moving in with another man. She promised she would call him back at 3:00 p.m. That call never came. The next day, a man walking his dog near Commerce Drive in Jonesboro, Arkansas, noticed something in a roadside ditch. As he got closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. A woman's body. Stacey Devine had been strangled and dumped like refuse. Investigators determined she had been taken elsewhere before her body was left in the ditch, suggesting planning movement and familiarity with the area. This was not a random act. Suspicion quickly turned to her husband, Charles Devine. When police contacted Charles and asked him to come identify his wife's body, his reaction was unsettling. He said he was on his way to Memphis and didn't immediately turn around. Instead, he stopped to get food. There was no urgency, no visible shock, no desperation to understand what had happened. Investigators took note. Stacey's car was later found abandoned exactly halfway between their home and where her body had been discovered. The location suggested someone who knew both areas well, someone who understood how to delay discovery. As police examined Charles's statements, inconsistencies piled up. He lied about where he had been. He lied about when he last saw Stacey. He lied about his movements. Cell phone records contradicted his story. Forensic timelines dismantled his alibi piece by piece. But despite mounting suspicion, the case stalled. Months turned into years. For 3.5 years, Stacey's family lived in limbo. They watched as the investigation seemed to fade, terrified that her case would become another unsolved statistic. There were no arrests, no charges, no closure. Then in 2019, everything changed. The television series Cold Justice revisited the case, bringing fresh eyes and advanced forensic analysis to the evidence that had been sitting idle. Experts re-examined Charles's cell phone data, mapping his movements with precision. The results were devastating. The timeline placed Charles exactly where he had insisted he was not. In July 2019, more than 3 years after Stacey's death, Charles Devine was arrested and charged. He was initially held on a $2 million bond. Later, he was released without bond while awaiting trial, a decision that deeply troubled Stacey's family. The trial finally began in October 2022. Prosecutors laid out a clear narrative. Stacey had been preparing to leave. Evidence suggested Charles had been stealing money from her. When she confronted him, and when she made clear she was done, he lost control. This wasn't a crime of passion in the romanticized sense. It was about ownership, control, and the refusal to accept that someone he believed belonged to him was walking away. The jury listened to days of testimony. They examined Charles's lies, his behavior, the forensic data, and the circumstances surrounding Stacey's final hours. On October 20th, 2022, the verdict came back. Guilty of second-degree charges. The jury did not convict him of first-degree charges, which would have required proof of premeditation. Instead, they concluded that Charles acted in the heat of rage when faced with losing control over Stacey's life. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, the maximum allowed for that conviction. At 62 years old at the time of sentencing, the punishment effectively amounted to a life sentence. For Stacey's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not peace. Her son, Emmanuel, lives with the knowledge that the last conversation he had with his mother was about her hope for freedom. A hope she never got to experience. Stacey's case highlights a grim reality, echoed by domestic violence experts again and again. Leaving is often the most dangerous moment. Victims can do everything right. They can plan, they can tell loved ones, they can try to start over. And still, violence can escalate with deadly speed when an abuser senses control slipping away. Stacy Devine did not die because she made a mistake. She died because someone chose possession over humanity. In the early morning hours of October 20th, 2008, Little Rock, Arkansas was quiet. Most of the city slept, unaware that a crime had already occurred that would haunt the state for years. Among those who should have been resting was Ann Presley, a 26-year-old morning news anchor for KATV Channel 7. She was scheduled to go on air at 5:00 a.m. for daybreak, a routine she followed religiously. When Ann didn't answer more than 40 wake-up calls from her parents, panic set in. Her mother, Patty Kennedy, drove to Ann's home near the Little Rock Country Club. The back door was wide open. Inside, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. Ann lay in her bed, barely alive. Her face was so swollen and bloodied that she was nearly unrecognizable. Every bone in her face had been shattered. Blood spattered the ceiling. Her left hand was broken from trying to defend herself. Patty called for an ambulance and prayed, but Ann never regained consciousness. 5 days later, on October 25th, 2008, Ann Presley passed away from massive brain swelling. The attack sent shockwaves through Arkansas. Ann wasn't just a victim, she was a familiar face, someone viewers welcomed into their homes every morning. Her career was rising. Just days earlier, she had celebrated a small role in an Oliver Stone film. Now she was gone. Police immediately launched an intensive investigation. The crime scene suggested a burglary gone wrong. Ann's laptop and handbag were missing. Her credit card was later used at a gas station miles away. Investigators believed the attacker may have entered through a door Ann left open for her dogs, an act of kindness exploited by a predator. DNA evidence recovered from Ann's body and bedroom would soon prove crucial. 90 miles away, in Marianna, Arkansas, police were working another unsolved case. Earlier that year, a schoolteacher named Kristen Edwards had been attacked in her home. She survived and provided DNA evidence, but no arrest had been made. In late November 2008, Marianna police stopped a vehicle with suspicious plates. The driver's story raised red flags. Within minutes, Little Rock detectives were alerted. The driver was Curtis Lavelle, Vance, 28 years old. Vance agreed to a DNA swab. The results came back the next day. They matched. The DNA connected Vance to both the Edwards assault and Ann Presley's killing. Within hours, police arrested him. During questioning, Vance offered conflicting stories. In one version, he claimed he entered Ann's home to steal laptops. In another, he described how he beat her repeatedly with a garden tool after she woke up and confronted him. At trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, DNA, forensic analysis, cell phone records, and Vance's own statements. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On November 11, 2009, Curtis Vance was found guilty of capital charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Ann's family, the verdict confirmed what they already knew, but it could not undo the loss. Patty Kennedy later said that after losing her only child, she destroyed family photographs because there was no one left to pass them on to. Ann Presley's death changed how Little Rock thought about safety. She had done nothing reckless, she had simply trusted her home. Her legacy lives on through scholarships, remembrance, and a city that will never forget the morning everything went wrong. In 2002, most families still believed the internet was harmless. Chat rooms felt innocent. Instant messaging felt safe. Parents warned their children about strangers in parking lots, not strangers behind screens. That blind spot would cost one Arkansas family everything. Her name was Casey Woody. Casey was 13 years old, a bright, kind teenager from Holland, Arkansas, trying to grow up in a world that had already taken too much from her. When she was 7, her mother was taken in a devastating car accident. Her father worked night shifts as a police officer. Like many kids her age, in the early 2000s, Casey spent time online, talking, exploring, connecting. That's where she met Dave. He said he was a 17-year-old boy from California, a surfer, friendly, understanding. He shared her interests. He listened when she talked about missing her mother. When he told her his aunt was in a coma from a car crash, it felt like fate, two kids bonded by the same pain. For more than a year, they talked regularly. Messages turned personal. Trust grew slowly, naturally, the way friendships do. At least that's what Casey believed. She had no way of knowing that none of it was real. Dave wasn't a teenage boy. He wasn't from California. He wasn't 17. He was David Fuller, a 47-year-old man with a disturbing history and a calculated plan. Fuller had been fired from multiple jobs for viewing inappropriate content. His ex-wife had contacted police about his behavior. He understood exactly how to exploit early chat rooms, how anonymity worked, how trust could be built over time, how vulnerable children could be isolated without raising suspicion. He didn't stumble upon Casey. He hunted her. He chose religious chat rooms where parents were less suspicious. He created fake photos, fake stories, fake empathy. And he groomed not only Casey, but several of her friends, learning their schedules, their routines, their weaknesses. December 3rd, 2002 looked like any other Tuesday. Casey was home alone that afternoon. Her brother was at college. Her father was working. It was routine, familiar, safe. David Fuller had been planning this day for months. He drove from California to Arkansas. He checked into a motel in Conway. He arrived at Casey's home and broke in. There was a struggle. Casey fought back. Her glasses were knocked aside. Her shoes were left behind. She was taken so quickly she didn't have time to put them on. The family's small dog was found injured, limping after trying to protect her. When Casey's brother returned home, he knew immediately something was wrong. The house was disturbed. Casey was gone. Within minutes, law enforcement was alerted. An Amber Alert was issued statewide. Investigators moved fast. They traced Casey's online conversations and uncovered the Dave persona. Through usernames and digital footprints, they identified David Fuller. Motel records placed him in Conway. Vehicle registration showed he was driving a white minivan. In less than 24 hours, police knew who they were looking for. But they were already too late. Fuller had taken Casey to a storage facility in Conway. Inside a rented unit, he parked the minivan and locked the door. There, he administered so much chloroform that Casey never regained consciousness. He chained her wrists and ankles to the floor of the van, rendering her completely helpless. He violated her while she was unconscious. Then he shot her in the head. On December 4th, 2002, police surrounded the storage unit. Fuller knew he was caught. Rather than face justice, he shot Casey again and then turned the gun on himself. When officers entered, they found both bodies inside the minivan. The investigation that followed revealed the full scale of Fuller's predatory behavior. In his apartment, investigators found a framed collage of Casey's photos, images she had sent to someone she believed was a teenage friend. They found addresses for her friends, evidence of grooming, evidence of plans that might have claimed more victims. One small mercy emerged from the medical examiner's report. Based on chloroform levels, experts concluded Casey was unconscious from the moment Fuller took her until her life ended. She never knew who he really was. She never experienced the terror of betrayal. It was the only comfort investigators could offer her devastated family. Casey Woody's case changed America. Before her, online predation was poorly understood. After her, everything shifted. Law enforcement developed specialized units. Schools introduced internet safety education. Parents learned that danger didn't just live on dark streets, it lived behind friendly usernames. Her family founded the Casey Woody Foundation, dedicating themselves to educating children and parents about grooming tactics and online safety. Her story became a warning, one that continues saving lives. Casey should have grown up. Instead, her legacy became protection for others. Not because of how David Fuller ended her life, but because her story exposed a threat the world could no longer ignore. When the sirens fade, when the courtroom's empty, when the headlines stop scrolling across screens, what remains is silence. Not peace, not closure, just silence. Across Arkansas, 10 stories unfolded that shattered lives in profoundly different ways. A grocery store that became a crime scene, a drifter whose violence crossed state lines, a final 911 call that never reached help in time, a public figure whose carefully crafted image concealed devastating harm, a death sentence that sparked decades of moral debate, a friendship that ended in betrayal, a man executed before science could speak, a woman killed for choosing freedom, a beloved news anchor taken in her own home, a child who trusted a voice behind a screen. These cases do not connect through a single motive or method, they connect through consequence. Each one leaves behind families who wake up every day to a world permanently altered, parents who outlive children, children who grow up without parents, communities that lose their sense of safety, survivors who measure time as before and after. And yet beneath the horror, there are patterns worth confronting. Violence often hides in plain sight behind routine respectability, faith, familiarity. Danger doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it waits patiently. Systems meant to protect can fail through delay, denial, or silence. And the cost of those failures is almost always paid by the innocent. These stories are not told to sensationalize suffering. They are told because forgetting is easy and forgetting is dangerous. Every name in these cases mattered long before they became part of a headline. They were more than victims. They were daughters and sons, friends and coworkers, people with futures that were never allowed to unfold. Justice, when it comes, is rarely clean. Sometimes it arrives late, sometimes it arrives incomplete, and sometimes it never arrives at all. What remains is responsibility. To listen, to question, to recognize warning signs, to refuse complacency. Because the line between normal life and irreversible tragedy is often thinner than anyone wants to believe. And once it's crossed, there is no rewind, only echoes. If these stories leave you unsettled, they should. They are reminders that behind every case file is a human life, and behind every statistic is a silence where someone should still be. That silence is the true aftermath of crime, and it is something none of us can afford to ignore.